My name is Grace, and I'm 29 years old. 3 years ago, my mother called me 14 days before my younger sister's wedding and said 7 words that shattered everything. I thought I knew about family. We've decided you're no longer a bridesmaid. I remember the exact smell of the air in my studio, mix of expensive cardstock and the faint, sweet scent of jasmine wafting through the open window. I was leaning over my drafting table, hand-painting the final flourishes on my sister Victoria's wedding invitations. I'd spent 6 months designing them for free. My fingers were stained with gold ink, the same gold that was supposed to match the silk dress hanging in my closet. "What do you mean, Mom?" I asked. My voice didn't shake, but my heart felt like it had skipped a floor in a falling elevator. I pressed the phone against my ear so hard the plastic felt cold and unforgiving. "Look, Grace," Linda said, her tone breezy, as if she were talking about a change in the catering menu rather than demoting her eldest daughter. "Victoria has added 2 more girls from her groom's side. The bridal party is getting quite large. We need the photos to be symmetrical, and honestly, the dress just fits the groom's sister better. You've been so stressed with work. We thought you'd be happier just sitting in the back as a guest. You don't have to worry about the hair and makeup schedule anymore." A heavy, suffocating silence followed. Outside, the sound of a neighbor's lawnmower droned on, a dull roar that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. "Did Dad agree to this?" I whispered. "Your father thinks we should do whatever makes the bride happy. Grace, it's her big day," she said. In the background, I heard the crisp snap of a newspaper being folded. My father, Robert, was right there. He didn't say a word. He never did. He just let the waves of my mother's cruelty wash over me, watching from the shore of his own comfort. "Anyway," she continued, "the florist is at the door. Make sure those invitations are in the mail by tomorrow. They really are lovely, dear. Bye." The line clicked shut. I stood there staring at the gold ink on my cuticles. The sun was streaming into my room, but I was shivering. I looked at the invitations, the hundreds of hours of labor, the delicate calligraphy, the love I had poured into a family that viewed me as an inconvenient footnote. I wasn't a sister. I wasn't a daughter. I was the reliable one. The one you could kick because you knew I wouldn't kick back. I was the one who was expected to provide the labor for the perfect family aesthetic while being cropped out of the frame. I walked over to my closet and looked at the bridesmaid dress. It was a soft seafoam green. I had paid for the alterations myself. Now it was just a ghost hanging in plastic. I reached out and touched the fabric. It was cold. Everything felt cold. I picked up a glass of lukewarm water from my desk and took a sip. It tasted like metal and disappointment. I thought about the hair and makeup schedule. I was the one who had organized it. I was the one who had booked the Airbnb for the girls. I was the one who had spent my weekends scouting locations for the perfect golden hour photos, Victoria demanded. And now, I was being told the photos would look better if I wasn't in them. "Symmetry," I whispered to the empty room. That was the word she used. But what she meant was erasure. I looked at the stack of invitations, finished and ready to be stuffed into envelopes. They were beautiful. They promised a day of joy, of union, of 2 families becoming one. But as I looked at my sister's name embossed in gold, I realized I was already outside of that union. I was the help. Something inside me went quiet. Not sad, not angry, just empty. I didn't cry. Had spent my entire life trying to be enough. I had been the straight A student, the one who never caused trouble, the one who always showed up early and stayed late to clean up the mess. I thought if I was perfect, they would have to see me. I thought if I made myself indispensable, they would have to love me. But standing there in the fading afternoon light, I realized the truth. You can't earn a place at a table where your seat was never built. I looked at my phone. There was a text from Victoria. "Hey, Mom told you, right? Don't be mad! It's just for the photos. You can still help me get into my dress in the morning. Love you." I didn't reply. I put the phone face down on the counter. The silence of the apartment started to feel different. It wasn't lonely anymore. It was heavy with the weight of a long overdue realization. I looked at the suitcase I'd already started to pack for the wedding weekend. I walked over, zipped it shut, and pushed it into the back of the closet. As the darkness settled in, something else settled too, a quiet decision I didn't even fully understand yet. If I wasn't needed for the symmetry of the photos, maybe I wasn't needed for the wedding at all. My eyes felt dry, like sand had been rubbed into them. Instead, I picked up the gold pen I'd been using. My hand was perfectly steady. I finished the flourish on the last invitation, capped the pen, and set it down. I walked to my kitchen and poured the rest of my bitter coffee down the sink. I watched the dark liquid swirl away, disappearing into the pipes. The golden ink on my fingers wouldn't wash off. I scrubbed my hands under the kitchen tap until the skin was raw and pink, but a faint shimmer remained in the creases of my knuckles. It was a permanent reminder of the labor I'd given away for a celebration. I was no longer invited to lead. I sat on my sofa, the velvet fabric cool against my legs, and stared at the dust motes dancing in the late afternoon sun. My mind didn't stay in the present. It drifted back, unspooling a reel of memories I had spent a decade trying to bury. The symmetry my mother spoke of wasn't new. It was the architecture of my entire life. I remembered my 8th birthday. I had saved my allowance for months to buy a small, lemon yellow cake with white frosting. I wanted a tea party. But that morning, Victoria tripped on the stairs and scraped her knee. It wasn't a deep cut, just a bead of blood and a loud, performative wail. My mother, Linda, didn't just comfort her. She canceled my party. "We can't have guests over while Victoria is in such pain." "Grace," she'd said, her voice flat, her eyes already focused on icing Victoria's knee with a bag of frozen peas. "It would be insensitive. We'll have your cake tomorrow." Tomorrow never came. The lemon cake sat in the fridge until the sponge went dry and the frosting turned into yellow wax. My father, Robert, had patted my head as he walked past me to get a beer. "Your mother knows best, Gracie," he'd whispered, his eyes never meeting mine. "Don't make a scene. You know how Victoria gets." I learned then that my joy was an optional extra in our household, while Victoria's discomfort was a national emergency. As I sat in my quiet apartment now, the sound of the city humming outside, I could almost taste the bitterness of that dry lemon cake. It was the taste of every skipped graduation dinner, every forgotten award ceremony, every time I was told to be the bigger person. Being the bigger person was just code for being the one who suffered in silence, so everyone else could stay comfortable. I stood up and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out an old photo album. I flipped through the pages. There we were at the Grand Canyon when I was 12. Victoria was in the center, wearing a bright pink hat, grinning at the camera. My mother had her arm around her. My father was leaning in, smiling. And there I was, standing 3 feet to the left, half-shadowed. My eyes were red from the flash, looking like I was hovering on the edge of a family I didn't quite belong to. I looked at the photo and realized my mother had been cropping me out for 20 years. She didn't need Photoshop. She just needed her cold, dismissive glare to push me to the periphery. I remembered my college graduation. I had worked 2 jobs to pay for my design degree. I was graduating magna cum laude. I had invited them months in advance. 2 days before the ceremony, Victoria decided she wanted to go on a spontaneous road trip with her friends to see a concert in Nashville. She needed the SUV. My parents decided to drive her there because she shouldn't be driving that far alone at 19. "We'll watch the live stream, Grace," my father had said over the phone, his voice echoing in a gas station parking lot. "We're so proud of you." But Victoria was so stressed, she really needed this break. I walked across that stage alone. I heard the roar of other families, the whistles, the screaming of names, the air horns. When they called Grace Miller, the silence from the stands felt like a physical blow. I went to a diner afterward and ate a cold grilled cheese sandwich, staring at my diploma. I thought about the texture of that bread, greasy, salty, and lonely. Now, at 29, the pattern had finally reached its logical conclusion. I was no longer even allowed in the symmetry of the wedding party. I was the designer, the planner, the emotional shock absorber, but I wasn't the daughter. I walked back to the kitchen and looked at the stack of wedding invitations. I picked one up. I ran my thumb over the raised gold lettering of Victoria's name. The anger I had suppressed for decades started to bubble up, not as a scream, but as a cold, hard clarity. It felt like ice water running through my veins. My father had a chance to choose me 1,000 times. He had 1,000 opportunities to look at my mother and say, "No, Grace is our daughter too. She stays." But he chose the path of least resistance. He chose the quiet house. He chose to let me drown so he didn't have to get his feet wet. I went to my desk and opened my laptop. I looked at the shared family calendar. There was a bridal brunch scheduled for tomorrow morning. I wasn't invited to the brunch, of course. I was just supposed to drop off the finished invitations at the restaurant and leave so they could have some girl time. My hand trembled as I hovered over the mouse. I realized that if I walked into that restaurant tomorrow, I would be walking into my own execution. I would be handing over the tools for them to celebrate my exclusion. I looked at my reflection in the darkened screen of my laptop. My eyes looked tired. I looked like someone who had spent 30 years asking for permission to exist. "No more," I whispered. The words felt strange in the empty room, heavy, dangerous. I sat in my apartment as the sun went down, watching the shadows stretch across my floor like long, reaching fingers. My father had a chance to choose me, and he chose silence instead. Something shifted in my chest. The reliable Grace was dying, and in her place, someone else was starting to breathe. The lowest point. The morning of the bridal brunch arrived with a cruel, mocking brightness. The sun spilled across my hardwood floors, illuminating the dust I'd been too exhausted to clean. I woke up with a hollow ache in my chest, the kind that feels like you've swallowed a stone. I looked at the stack of invitations on my counter. 150 envelopes hand-addressed in gold ink. Each one was a testament to my devotion, and each one felt like a slap in the face. Was supposed to drop them off at the Gilded Lily, a high-end bistro downtown. At 11 a.m., I wasn't invited to stay for the mimosas or the laughter. I was just the delivery girl. I dressed in a plain gray sweater and jeans. I didn't want to be seen. I wanted to fade into the background just like they wanted. I boxed up the invitations, the cardboard scratching against my numb fingers. The drive to the restaurant was a blur. The smell of exhaust and hot asphalt filled my car, mixing with the lingering scent of the jasmine in my studio. When I pulled up to the valet, I saw them through the large plate glass window. There was Victoria, radiant in a white sundress, her blonde hair perfectly curled. My mother, Linda, was sitting next to her, leaning in, touching Victoria's cheek with a tenderness I hadn't felt in a decade. They were surrounded by the symmetrical bridesmaids, girls I barely knew, laughing and clinking crystal flutes filled with amber liquid. I saw my mother point at a floral arrangement, her mouth moving in a sharp, decisive command. She looked powerful. She looked happy. I stood on the sidewalk, the heavy box of invitations in my arms. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I took a step toward the door, then stopped. I saw my father, Robert, standing near the bar. He looked uncomfortable, tugging at his collar, his eyes darting around the room. He caught my silhouette through the glass. For a split second, our eyes met. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He looked away, focusing intently on a bowl of lemons on the bar. He chose the lemons over his daughter. The stone in my chest shattered. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. If I walked through those doors, I knew I would disappear forever. I turned around, walked back to my car, and slammed the box into the trunk. I drove. I didn't have a destination. I just needed the wind to wash the sight of them off my skin. I ended up at a local park, sitting on a bench near a stagnant pond. It was the 4th of July weekend, a time for family, for fireworks, for belonging. Families were scattered across the grass on checkered blankets. I watched a father lift his toddler onto his shoulders, both of them cheering as a frisbee flew past. The smell of charcoal smoke and grilled hot dogs filled the air. It was a happy smell, a communal smell. I sat there for 4 hours. My phone started blowing up. Linda, 11:15 a.m., where are you? The girls need to see the proofs. Don't be difficult, Grace. Victoria, 11:45 a.m. Just drop them at the front desk if you're throwing a tantrum. Robert, 12:30 p.m. Grace, your mother is upset. Just bring the boxes and apologize. Let's have a peaceful day. Peaceful, I whispered. To him, peace meant my silence. To him, peace meant my erasure. I felt a tear finally break loose. It rolled down my cheek, hot and stinging. Then another. I didn't sob. I just leaked. I sat on that bench, surrounded by hundreds of happy strangers, and realized that I was completely, utterly alone. I had no home to go to. The house I grew up in was a museum dedicated to a sister who didn't love me and a mother who didn't want me. I looked at my hands. The gold ink was still there, shimmering under the harsh July sun. I stood up and walked to the trash can near the pond. I opened my trunk. I took out the box of invitations, 6 months of my life, my art, my heart. I dumped them. All of them. The gold embossed envelopes tumbled into the bin, landing on top of discarded soda cans and sticky ice cream wrappers. I felt a strange, terrifying jolt of electricity go through me. I got back in my car and drove to a small, dingy diner on the edge of town. It was the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of old grease. It was empty except for a tired-looking waitress scrubbing the counter. I sat in the back booth and ordered a plate of cold turkey and a bitter cup of black coffee. Holiday special? The waitress asked, her voice raspy. Sure, I said. When the plate arrived, the turkey was dry, the gravy was congealed, and the peas were mushy. It was the saddest meal I had ever seen. I picked up my fork, but my hand was shaking too hard to eat. I looked at the empty seat across from me. This was it. The lowest point? I was 29, and I was eating a lonely holiday meal in a graveyard of a diner because my family found me asymmetrical. I pressed my napkin to my eyes, hoping the waitress wouldn't notice. I felt like a ghost. I felt like if I walked out into the street, cars would pass right through me because there wasn't enough of grace left to be solid. I grabbed my coat. If I was going to be alone, I couldn't stay in this silence. I needed to move. I needed to find somewhere with actual food, with light, with life. I just had to find a place that was still open, a place where a ghost could feel human again. I walked out into the humid evening air, the sound of the first distant fireworks, echoing like gunshots in the quiet sky. Seriously? You're ruining the vibe. The city was a kaleidoscope of red, white and blue, but all I could see was gray. The fireworks were beginning to bloom over the skyline, bursts of artificial light that illuminated the tears drying on my cheeks. I drove aimlessly, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned a ghostly white. I couldn't go back to my apartment. The silence there was a predator, waiting to swallow me whole. I needed noise. I needed the presence of people who didn't know my name. People who didn't have a list of reasons why I wasn't enough. I found myself in a neighborhood I rarely visited, a place of old brownstones and cobblestone streets, where golden light spilled from basement windows and the smell of wood smoke and roasting. Garlic hung heavy in the humid air. I saw a small hand-painted sign hanging over a weathered wooden door. The Hearth and Vine. It wasn't a chain. It wasn't aesthetic. It looked like a place that had survived 100 winters. I pulled over, my breath hitching in my throat. I stepped out of the car, the soles of my shoes clicking against the uneven stones. As I pushed open the door, a small brass bell chimed. The warmth hit me first, not just the temperature, but a palpable sense of safety. The air smelled like fresh-baked rosemary bread and expensive red wine. Soft jazz hummed in the background, woven through the low murmur of intimate conversations and the rhythmic clink-clink of silverware. Just one? I looked up. A woman stood there, perhaps in her late 60s. She had silver hair pulled into a messy, elegant bun and eyes the color of a stormy sea. Sharp, but incredibly kind. She wore a simple linen apron over a dark dress. This was Eleanor. Yes, I whispered, my voice cracking. Just me. Eleanor didn't look at her seating chart. She didn't look at the clock. She looked at me. Her gaze lingered on my eyes, then dropped to my hands, still stained with that faint, mocking gold ink. You look like you've walked through a storm, honey, she said softly. I tried to pull myself together. I tried to give her the polite, reliable grace smile, but my face felt like shattered glass. I looked down at my feet. I just needed somewhere to sit. I can leave if you're full. Nonsense, Eleanor said. She reached out, a brief, warm touch on my forearm that felt like an electric shock of kindness. We always have room for one more, especially tonight. She led me past the crowded booths to a small, circular table in the corner, tucked behind a large potted fern. It was private, yet I could see the whole room. She pulled out the chair for me. We saved you a seat, she said, her voice steady and warm. I sat down, the velvet cushion of the chair catching me as if I were falling. I looked at the bread. I touched the crust. It was still hot. I took a bite, and the taste, salty, herbaceous, and rich, hit me like a memory of a home I'd never actually had. I felt a sob bubble up in my throat. I pressed my napkin to my eyes, trying to stifle the sound. It's all right, Eleanor's voice came from nearby. She wasn't hovering, but she was there. In this house, we don't mind a few tears. They're just the heart's way of washing the windows. I sat there for an hour, slowly eating the best meal of my life, a slow-roasted chicken with root vegetables that tasted like comfort. For the first time in 29 years, I wasn't performing. I wasn't designing the perfect invitations for someone else's life. I was just Grace. As I was finishing, a younger man walked in from the back alley, carrying a crate of fresh produce. He was tall, with kind eyes and a crooked smile that seemed to reach all the way to his soul. This was Marcus. He caught my eye as he passed, and for a second, the world seemed to slow down. He didn't look through me. He didn't look at the symmetry of the room. He looked at me as if I were the most interesting thing in the building. Try the blackberry cobbler, he said, pausing by my table. My mom, Eleanor, made it herself. It's like a hug in a bowl. I think I'd like a hug, I said, the honesty of it surprising even me. Marcus smiled, and it wasn't a polite stranger's smile. It was a promise. Coming right up. As the night deepened and the last of the fireworks faded into the dark, I realized I hadn't looked at my phone once. The texts from Linda and Victoria were still there, rotting in my pocket, but their power was fading. I looked at Eleanor and Richard, laughing together at the bar as they polished glasses. I looked at Marcus, who was watching me with a quiet, patient curiosity. I had walked in as a ghost, an acceptable sacrifice at the altar of my sister's wedding. But in this small, warm room filled with the smell of rosemary and the sound of chosen family, I felt the first faint, terrifying spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. But as I reached for my purse to pay, a shadow crossed the window outside. A car had pulled up, a sleek, white SUV I recognized all too well. A man appeared from the kitchen, tall, broad-shouldered, with a salt and pepper beard and a gentle strength in his movements. This was Richard. He placed a small wooden board on my table. On it was a thick slice of warm bread, a small pool of olive oil, and a sprig of rosemary, best bread in the city. Richard said, his voice a deep, comforting rumble. Eat, you need the strength. I froze. The silver spoon in my hand felt suddenly heavy. Through the glass of the restaurant door, I saw the silhouette of my mother, Linda. She was stepping out of the SUV, her eyes scanning the street with that sharp, predatory focus she used when she was managing a crisis. Behind her, my father lingered by the driver's side door, looking at his watch. They had tracked my phone. Panic surged through me, a cold tide that made my lungs feel tight. I looked around the warm, safe cocoon of the hearth and vine. I didn't want them here. I didn't want their symmetry to touch this rosemary-scented sanctuary. Eleanor noticed my change in posture instantly. She walked over, her linen apron rustling softly. She followed my gaze to the window, then back to my face, which I knew must be pale as bone. Friends of yours? She asked quietly. My parents, I whispered, my voice trembling. I don't think I can do this right now, Eleanor. Eleanor didn't ask for an explanation. She didn't tell me to be the bigger person or go talk to them. She simply placed a hand on the back of my chair and looked at Marcus, who was already moving toward the door. Richard, Eleanor called out firmly. Richard stepped out from the bar, his broad shoulders filling the space. I've got it, Elle. I watched, heart hammering against my ribs, as Richard opened the door just as my mother reached for the handle. Can I help you? Richard's voice was a low, impenetrable wall of politeness. We're looking for our daughter, Linda said, her voice high and demanding. The tone she used with waiters and subordinates. She's in there. Grace? Grace, get out here! We have a dozen people waiting for those invitations. I'm sorry, ma'am, Richard said, not budging an inch. This is a private event tonight. Unless you have a reservation, I'm going to have to ask you to stay on the sidewalk. A private event? Don't be ridiculous, Linda snapped. Grace, Robert, tell this man who we are. My father stepped forward, his voice a weak mumble. Sir, we just want to talk to her. It's a family matter. In this house, Richard said, his voice dropping an octave, we respect the peace of our guests. And right now, you're disturbing it. Move along. I watched my mother's face turn a mottled red, a mix of embarrassment and fury. She looked past Richard's shoulder, trying to catch my eye. But Marcus stepped into her line of sight, blocking her view of my corner table. For the first time in my life, someone was standing between me and the storm. Grace, my mother shrieked one last time. You are being incredibly selfish. Think of your sister. Then the door closed. Richard turned the deadbolt with a decisive thwack. The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of my apartment. It was the silence of a shield that had held. I watched the SUV peel away, tires screeching against the cobblestones. I collapsed back into my chair, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I expected Eleanor to ask me what I'd done. I expected her to judge me for being a difficult daughter. Instead, she sat down in the chair across from me. She reached out and took my shaking hands in hers. Her skin was warm, calloused from years of work, and smelled faintly of flour and lemon zest. Take a breath, Grace, she said softly. You're safe. The doors are locked? I'm so sorry, I sobbed, the tears finally flowing freely. I've made a mess. I'm always the one who makes the mess. No, honey, Eleanor said, leaning in. You're the one who's been carrying the mess everyone else made. You just finally decided to put the heavy boxes down. There's no shame in that. Marcus walked over and set a fresh cup of tea in front of me, honey and chamomile, the steam rising in gentle curls. He pulled up a stool and sat beside us. They seem intense, Marcus said, his voice gentle, devoid of judgment. They're my family, I said, the word feeling bitter in my mouth. Family is a strong word, Richard added, leaning against the bar as he wiped his hands on a towel. But it isn't always a biological one. Sometimes, family is just the people who don't make you feel like you have to shrink to fit in the room. I stayed there long after the restaurant officially closed. They didn't kick me out. Richard put on a record of soft, soulful blues. Eleanor brought out a bowl of warm cherries and chocolate. We talked, not about symmetry or weddings or gold ink, but about art, about the city, about the way the light hits the river at dawn. For the first time, I wasn't an acceptable sacrifice. I was a guest. I was a person. As Marcus walked me to my car later that night, the air had cooled. The smell of the rain on the hot pavement was sharp and clean. "Will you come back?" he asked, his eyes searching mine in the dim glow of the street lamp. "Not as a guest, just to see us." I looked at his crooked smile, at the steady way he held himself. I thought about the gold ink on my hands. It was still there, but it was fading. "I think I'd like that," I said. As I drove home, I realized I didn't feel like a ghost anymore. I felt like a seed that had finally been dropped into good soil. The wedding was in 10 days. My mother would be calling. Victoria would be screaming. But as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a small sprig of rosemary that Eleanor had tucked into my coat pocket. I brought it to my nose and breathed in. The healing had begun, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the silence. The 10 days leading up to Victoria's wedding were supposed to be a marathon of crisis management. My phone became a battlefield. My mother left voicemails that alternated between sobbing, pleas, and ice-cold threats. My sister sent photos of her ruined invitations, the ones I had designed. But she had to reprint at a local shop because I wouldn't deliver the originals from the trash. But for the first time in my life, I didn't answer the call to arms. Instead, I spent my mornings at the hearth and vine. It started with me bringing my sketchbook, sitting in the corner with a latte that tasted of real vanilla bean and hazelnut. But slowly the corner expanded. "Grace, what do you think of this layout for the weekend menu?" Eleanor asked one Tuesday morning. She laid a chalkboard on my table. I looked at it. My designer's eye immediately saw the cramped spacing. I picked up a piece of white chalk. "If you move the specials to the center and use a bit of copperplate script here, it feels more like an invitation to a feast." As I drew, I felt a strange warmth in my chest. I wasn't doing this because I was afraid of her disapproval. I was doing it because she asked for my vision, not just my labor. "Beautiful," Eleanor whispered, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "You have a gift for making things feel seen, Grace. I hope you know that." Marcus was always there, too. He was the one who taught me how to properly sear a scallop, his hands steady and patient over mine as the butter sizzled and popped in the pan. The kitchen was loud, chaotic, and smelled of lemon and searing protein. But with Marcus, it felt like a dance. "You're overthinking the flip," he laughed one evening, his breath warm against my ear as he stood behind me. "Just trust the heat. It'll let go when it's ready." I looked up at him, the glow of the industrial stove reflecting in his eyes. I'm not used to things letting go when they're ready. Usually I have to pry them loose. Marcus went quiet. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear, his thumb grazing my temple. "In this kitchen, we don't force anything. We just provide the right environment and wait for the magic." That night, after the last guest had left, Marcus and I sat on the back steps of the restaurant. The city air was thick with the scent of blooming lindens and distant rain. We shared a bottle of crisp white wine, the condensation slick on the glass. "Tell me about your art," he said. "Not the stuff you do for your family. The stuff you do for you." I told him about the landscapes. I painted at 3 a.m. I told him about the way I loved the texture of heavy paper and the way certain colors made me feel like I was finally breathing. He listened, really listened, the way my father never had. He didn't interrupt. He didn't bring the conversation back to himself. "I want to see them," he said. "All of them." "They're not very symmetrical," I joked, the old wound flaring for a second. My phone vibrated on the nightstand at 6 a.m. A text from my father. "Grace, the car is leaving in an hour. Please. Your mother hasn't slept. Just show up for the ceremony. For me." I looked at the text. For me. The same phrase he had used to keep me small for 20 years. I didn't reply. I got out of bed, made myself a cup of strong, bitter coffee, and looked at the dress I had bought. It wasn't seafoam green. It was a deep, defiant crimson. I wasn't going to the wedding. Instead, I spent the day at the restaurant. I helped Eleanor prep the flower boxes. I helped Richard fix a loose floorboard. I laughed with Marcus over a burnt batch of cookies. The day was full, bright, and entirely mine. As the sun began to set, the exact time Victoria would be walking down the aisle, I stood in the kitchen of the Hearth and Vine. I was covered in flour. My hair was a mess, and I was helping Marcus plate a massive order of pasta. The smell of garlic, wine, and joy filled the room. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A voicemail from my mother. I stepped into the alley to listen. "You're a monster, Grace." Her voice was a hiss, whispered from the back of the church. "Everyone is asking where you are. You've embarrassed us. You've ruined your sister's Symmetry. Don't bother coming home, ever." I deleted the message. I looked up at the stars peeking through the city's glow. I felt a pang of grief. Yes, the death of a hope I'd carried since I was 8 years old. But under that grief was a foundation of granite. I walked back inside. Marcus was waiting by the pass-through, a plate of food in his hand and a look of concern on his face. "You okay?" he asked. I looked at him, then at Eleanor and Richard sharing a laugh at the bar, then at the beautiful, messy life swirling around me. "I've never been better," I said. I took the plate from him, and as our fingers brushed, I realized that the symmetry of my old life was a cage. And I had finally found the key. Marcus turned to me, his expression suddenly serious. "Symmetry is for machines, Grace. Beauty is in the break. It's in the way things grow toward the light, even when they're crooked." He kissed me then. It wasn't the frantic, desperate kiss of someone trying to possess me. It was slow, tasted of blackberries and wine, and felt like a quiet welcome home. For the first time, I wasn't being chosen because I was useful. I was being chosen because I was me. By Friday, the big day had arrived. The year that followed was a blur of golden light and steady ground. I didn't just work at the Hearth and Vine. I became part of its heartbeat. My apartment, once a tomb of easy silence, was now filled with sketches of Eleanor's garden and Marcus's laughter. But as my relationship with Marcus deepened into a quiet, unshakable love, a strange shadow lingered in the back of my mind. In the eyes of the law and in the eyes of the world, I was still the daughter of Linda and Robert Miller. Their names were on my birth certificate. Their legacy was the weight I carried. It was a rainy Tuesday in November. The smell of damp pavement and wood smoke drifted through the restaurant's open door. Eleanor was sitting at the back table, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, meticulously going over the payroll. "Grace, honey," she said, looking up as I polished the brass rail of the bar. "You've been staring at that same spot for 10 minutes. What's on your mind?" I set the cloth down. My heart started to thud, a rhythmic thump-thump against my ribs. I was thinking about the wedding. Eleanor's expression softened. Marcus and I had decided to get married in the spring, a small, intimate ceremony right here, in the place where I finally woke up. "Are you worried about them showing up?" "No," I said, and to my surprise, I meant it. "I'm worried about who I am when I walk down that aisle. I don't want to be a Miller anymore, Eleanor. Not just because of the name, but because I don't want to belong to people who only value me when I'm invisible." I walked over and sat across from her. The table smelled of lemon wax and old paper. "You and Richard, you gave me a seat when I was a stranger. You chose me when my own blood didn't have room for me." Eleanor reached across the table, her hand warm and steady over mine. "We didn't just give you a seat, Grace. You earned your place here. You're our daughter in every way that matters." "Then let's make it official," I whispered. "Adult adoption." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was sacred. Eleanor's eyes shimmered with sudden tears. In the U.S., adult adoption is a rare but powerful legal statement, a way to say that family is a choice, not a biological sentence. It would mean that legally Linda and Robert would no longer be my parents. Eleanor and Richard would. "Oh, Grace," Eleanor breathed, her voice thick with emotion. Nothing would make us prouder. When we told Richard and Marcus that night over a dinner of thick beef stew and crusty sourdough, Richard didn't say much. He just stood up, walked around the table, and pulled me into a hug that smelled of cedarwood and strength. "I've been waiting for a daughter like you my whole life," he rumbled into my hair. The next few months were a whirlwind of paperwork and planning. I chose a heavy, cream-colored cardstock. I used the gold ink again, but this time my hands didn't shake. The ink didn't feel like a stain. It felt like a signature. Grace Eleanor Ruth. And Marcus. But as the date approached, the fear of my past began to itch at the back of my neck. I hadn't spoken to my biological parents since the night of Victoria's wedding. I had blocked their numbers, but I knew they were watching. In our small-town circles, news travels fast. They knew about the restaurant. They knew about Marcus. And they definitely knew about the adoption papers that had been served to them as part of the legal severance. One evening, while Marcus and I were hanging string lights on the patio, the air smelling of early spring rain and budding lilacs, he noticed my hesitation. "You're thinking about them," he said, stepping off the ladder and taking my hands. His touch was the only thing that could ground me when my thoughts started to spiral. "They're going to come, Marcus," I said, looking at the flickering lights. "My mother won't be able to help herself. She won't let me have a perfect day without trying to manage the image." Marcus leaned his forehead against mine. "Let them come. They'll find a wall they can't break through. You aren't that shrinking girl in the studio anymore. Grace, you're a woman who was chosen first." I wanted to believe him. I did believe him. But as I tucked the final adoption decree into my desk drawer, I felt a tremor in my soul. The legal bond was sealed. My new name was etched in stone. But the final confrontation, the moment where I would have to look my biological mother in the eye and tell her she no longer had power over me, was looming on the horizon like a summer storm. I looked at the crimson dress hanging in my closet, ready for the ceremony. It wasn't just a dress. It was armor. It was a strange, healing irony. I was designing wedding invitations again, but this time they were for my wedding. And this time there was no symmetry to maintain, only love. The day of my wedding arrived, and the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, clean promise of a spring rain. The hearth and vine had been transformed. Thousands of tiny white lights draped from the rafters like fallen stars, and the tables were laden with fresh bread, local honey, and the rich, earthy aroma of Richard's signature roast. I stood in the small office upstairs, smoothing the silk of my crimson dress. I looked in the mirror and didn't see the girl who had scrubbed gold ink off her knuckles in a lonely kitchen. I saw a woman whose eyes were clear, whose shoulders were square. Beside me, Eleanor was adjusting my veil, a simple, elegant thing. She caught my eye in the reflection. "You are breathtaking, Grace," she whispered. Her hand was steady on my shoulder. "Are you ready?" "I am," I said, and I meant it. But as the first notes of the cello began to drift up through the floorboards, a sudden, sharp commotion broke out downstairs. The front door of the restaurant didn't just open. It slammed. I heard a voice I hadn't heard in a year, a voice that used to make my stomach turn into lead. "Get out of my way. This is my daughter's wedding, and I will not be barred from it." My mother. I felt a cold shiver race down my spine, but it didn't paralyze me. I turned to Eleanor. Her face had hardened into a mask of protective steel. "Stay here," she said. "No," I replied, my voice sounding deeper than I expected. "I'm not hiding anymore." I walked down the stairs, the silk of my dress rustling against the wood. At the bottom, the scene was chaos. My mother, Linda, was dressed in a pale pink suit, the exact color Victoria had worn for her rehearsal dinner. She looked frantic, her eyes darting around the room, critiquing the lack of symmetry even as she invaded it. My father, Robert, stood 3 steps behind her, looking at the floor, his hands stuffed into his pockets. Richard and Marcus were a wall of muscle and resolve between the door and the altar. "Grace!" Linda shrieked when she saw me. "What is this? This red dress? It's tacky. And we received papers, adoption papers. Have you lost your mind? You are a Miller. You don't just choose a new mother." The room went silent. My guests, the chosen family I had built, looked on with a mix of horror and pity. I walked past Marcus, who reached out to take my hand. I squeezed his fingers, then let go. I stepped forward until I was only 2 feet away from the woman who had spent 29 years making me feel like an extra in my own life. "You're right, Linda," I said. My voice was calm. It was the sound of a frozen lake. "You don't just choose a new mother. You earn one. And Eleanor earned that title every day that you spent ignoring me." "How dare you?" Linda hissed, her face contorting. "After everything we did for you? The house, the food? You provided a roof," I interrupted. "But you never provided a home. You used me as the glue to hold Victoria's life together while mine was falling apart. You told me there was no room for me. Remember, 7 words? 14 days before Victoria's wedding." I looked over her shoulder at my father. And you, Dad, you watched it happen. You watched me drown in that silence because you were too afraid to make Mom angry. Your silence wasn't peace. It was a betrayal. Robert looked up then, his eyes watery. Grace, honey, it's not like that. She had no audience. Fine, she spat, her voice trembling with a fury she couldn't control. Keep your little bistro. Keep your chosen family. But don't you dare come crying to us when this fails. You're nothing without us. I was nothing with you, I said. Without you, I'm finally whole. She turned on her heel and marched out. The brass bell on the door jangling violently. My father lingered for a second. He looked at me, a flash of genuine regret in his eyes. But then Linda barked his name from the sidewalk. He followed her. He chose the silence one last time. The door closed. The silence that followed was different. It was clean. It was the air after a fever breaks. I turned back to Marcus. My heart was racing, but the weight was gone. The symmetry was broken, and in its place was something jagged, beautiful, and real. Where were we? I asked, a small smile finally breaking through. Marcus stepped forward, took my face in his hands, and kissed my forehead. We were just getting to the part where you become mine forever. The weeks following the wedding felt like the first deep breath after being underwater for a lifetime. The restaurant settled. Back into its rhythm, the smell of roasting, coffee in the mornings, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the steady, comforting weight of the wedding ring on my finger. But the silence from my biological family was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the silence of neglect. It was the silence of a closed book. A month after the ceremony, a thick envelope arrived at the Hearth and Vine. No return address. I knew the handwriting immediately, my father's cramped, hesitant print. I took it to the back patio, sitting on the same wooden steps where Marcus and I had shared our first kiss. The spring air was sweet with the scent of rain-damp earth and the jasmine I had planted in terracotta pots. My hands didn't shake as I slid the letter opener through the paper. Inside were 3 things: a check for the amount I had spent on Victoria's invitations, a small faded photograph, and a letter. Grace, it began. Your mother hasn't spoken your name since the wedding. She's redesigned your old room into a nursery for Victoria's baby. She says she's moving on, but I find myself sitting in the garage most nights, looking at the things you left behind. I found this photo in an old box. It's from the day we brought you home. I'm sorry I didn't say more. I'm sorry I wasn't the man you needed me to be. I hope you find the peace I was too cowardly to give you. I looked at the photo. It was me, a tiny screaming infant wrapped in a white blanket. My father was holding me, looking down with a face full of terrified, genuine love. I waited for the old familiar ache to return. I waited for the urge to call him, to forgive him, to slide back into the role of the fixer. But the feeling didn't come. I looked at the check. It was a refund for labor they had stolen. I looked at the photo. It was a memory of a man who loved me in secret, but shamed me in public. I realized then that closure isn't a conversation you have with someone else. It's a funeral you hold for the version of them you kept hoping would show up. Grace? Marcus's voice drifted from the doorway. He was holding 2 glasses of iced tea, the mint leaves floating near the rim. He saw the letter in my lap. You okay? I handed him the photo. He looked at it for a long time, then sat down beside me, his shoulder a warm, solid presence against mine. He's sorry, I said quietly. Is that enough? Marcus asked. It's enough to know it wasn't my fault, I replied. But it's not enough to invite the storm back into the house. I stood up and walked to the small fire pit we kept for chilly evenings. I dropped the letter inside. I kept the photo not for him, but for the little girl in the blanket who deserved better. I watched the paper curl and blacken, the smell of wood smoke rising into the twilight. 6 months later, the healing took a new, miraculous shape. The morning was crisp, the smell of cinnamon rolls filling the restaurant as Eleanor prepped for the brunch rush. I was sitting at the bar trying to finish a design for a local charity gala when a sudden wave of nausea hit me. Eleanor froze, a tray of pastries in her hands. She looked at me, really, looked at me, with that mother's intuition that defied biology. Grace, she whispered, setting the tray down. How long has it been? The realization hit me like a sunburst. 3 days later, I stood in the bathroom of our small apartment above the bistro, staring at 2 pink lines. My heart wasn't hammering with fear this time. It was singing. When I told Marcus, he didn't just cheer, he wept. He held my stomach as if it were the most fragile, precious thing in the world. They'll never have to earn it, he whispered against my skin. This baby. They will never have to wonder if there's room. I looked out the window at the glow of the hearth and vine below. I thought about the symmetry my mother loved so much. My life wasn't symmetrical. It was messy, it was hard-won, and it was built on the ruins of a family that didn't want me. But as I felt the first flutter of new life within me, I knew that the cycle was broken. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a creator. I was a mother. And I was finally, legally and spiritually, home. The morning my daughter was born, the air in the hospital room didn't smell like antiseptic and fear. It smelled like the lilies Marcus had tucked into a vase by the window and the faint, lingering scent of rosemary. On Eleanor's sweater as she held my hand through the final hours of labor, when they placed the baby in my arms, I didn't look for symmetry. I didn't look for a resemblance to a family that had discarded me. I looked at her tiny, reaching fingers and her fierce, steady gaze, and I saw a beginning. We named her Lily, after the flowers that filled the restaurant on the day I finally stood tall. I am 34 years old now. 5 years have passed since the day that phone call changed my life. Sometimes I sit in the back of the hearth and vine after the dinner rush, watching Lily help Richard polish the brass or seeing Marcus lift her onto his shoulders to turn off the string lights. The gold ink is long gone from my knuckles, replaced by the charcoal of my sketches and the soft, sticky handprints of a child who knows she is the center of her world. I've learned that the greatest lie I was ever told was that I had to be useful to be loved. I spent 3 decades believing that if I designed the perfect invitations, if I stayed silent during the storms, if I made myself the acceptable sacrifice, I would eventually earn a seat at the table. But love isn't a wage, it's a gift. I look at the crimson dress I still keep in the back of my closet. It reminds me of the day I stopped asking for permission to exist. It reminds me that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to let the wrong people lose you. My biological parents are strangers to me now. I hear snippets of their lives. Victoria has a second child. My mother is still obsessed with the image of her perfect holidays, but it feels like news from a foreign country. I've never visited. I don't hate them. Hate is too heavy a thing to carry into the life I've built. I simply release them. I look at Eleanor and Richard, the parents I chose and who chose me back. They taught me that family isn't about DNA. It's about who shows up when the lights go out. It's about the people who see your asymmetry and call it art. The legacy I am leaving for Lily won't be one of guilt or silence. It will be one of warmth, of rosemary-scented kitchens, and the absolute, unshakable knowledge that in this home, there is always, always room. CTA section. If you're watching this and you've been the scapegoat of your family, if you've been told you're too much or too sensitive or always causing drama just because you dared to ask to be treated fairly, I want you to know something. It's not you. It never was. You deserve to be chosen. Not as a backup, not as a last resort, not as the acceptable sacrifice when someone else's comfort is at stake. Chosen first. Chosen fully. Chosen without conditions. Family isn't blood. Family isn't obligation. Family isn't people who share your DNA but treat you like a burden. Family is the people who show up. The people who see you crying alone and invite you to their table. The people who open their hearts and their homes and make you officially, permanently, undeniably theirs. I spent 29 years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. And then I spent 5 years learning what love actually looks like. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far this story reaches. And if you want more stories like this, check the description. I've linked some of my favorites there. Until next time, remember, you deserve to be chosen.